Thank you very much, Mr. Weiner, for your kind introduction. I am indeed honored to be here this morning. It is always a tremendous honor to be in the presence of my wife, Dr. Maya Ranking Member Cummings. I want to thank you for being here today, too. Today, I want to talk about an issue that is extremely personal for me and my family, and that is the issue of gun violence. In June 2011, I lost my nephew, Christopher, to a senseless act of gun violence. Christopher was just 20 years old. He was a student at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Like the beautiful children who lost their lives at Sandy Hook, he was an amazing young man with his entire life ahead of him. It is a painful thing to see your nephew, your son, or your daughter, to see their blood splattered over walls and couches or wherever they may have been killed. Suddenly, like countless others, I lived the unimaginable suffering of losing a loved one due to gun violence. The pain I still feel in my heart today, even 2 years later. Last week, during his press conference urging the country not to forget the massacre in Newtown, the president was joined by 21 mothers who are fighting for legislation to reduce gun violence. And let me tell you, I fully understand their passion. I fully understand their pain. And I also fully understand their purpose. Because when you lose a family member like that, you just don't mourn them at their funeral. You mourn them every single day of your life. You mourn for the person that they could have been. And for children murdered at 5 and 6 years old, as they were at Sandy Hook, you mourn every missed birthday, every graduation, every Christmas, and that's right, every Easter. Every milestone missed is a reminder of the life they could have led had it not been so brutally and violently snatched away. So you see, we are not only mourning what we've lost, we're also mourning what could have been. This loss leads to great passion in me and in all those family members. But it just doesn't lead to great passion in those family members. It leads to great passion in those who hear about these incidents, those who were the neighbors and friends of these children, those who went to church with them. The passion is deep and powerful, and that passion must and will, I am thoroughly convinced, lead to change. We will not forget. We will fight and keep fighting for gun safety legislation. And I will fight for that legislation until I die. I want to start today by talking about our current fight against the problem of gun trafficking and straw purchasing, which I've been working on for several years. At a bipartisan forum on gun trafficking that I organized last month, we heard from first responders and law enforcement officials who were victims of gun trafficking crimes. Far too often, it is our brave law enforcement officers and first responders who find themselves on the wrong end of a gun barrel. I want to share some of their stories with you today, lest we never forget. And I think we need to constantly remind ourselves of these stories so that they are printed in the DNA of every cell of our brains as we debate the gun issue. One of these brave men is Ted Scardino, a firefighter from West Webster, New York. He suffered multiple gunshot wounds when his unit was responding to a fire alarm on Christmas Eve 3 months ago. That fire turned out to be an ambush. It was set by a man named William Spengler, a convicted felon who served 17 years in prison for killing his 92-year-old grandmother with a hammer. Despite his history of violence, Spengler convinced his neighbor to buy the 12-gauge shotgun and Bushmaster rifle he used to murder 2 firefighters and injure 2 others, including Mr. Scardino. Over here are pictures of 2 firefighters who lost their lives that day. 19-year-old Thomas Chikowska and his mentor, Mike Cipollini. Mike left behind a wife and 2 young daughters and a son. They titled this a reality check. That's the reality. That's the reality. They're no longer with us. They're dead. We also heard from Chief Joseph Lawrence of Plymouth Township, that's in Pennsylvania, who talked about the loss of one of his own officers, Brad Fox. Officer Fox was directing traffic when Andrew Thomas, a convicted felon, swerved into oncoming traffic. When Officer Fox gave chase, Thomas shot and killed him before turning the gun on himself. For some reason, a straw purchaser willingly bought 7 handguns and 2 rifles for this killer, even though he was a convicted felon. Something is awfully wrong with that picture. Officer Fox was only 34 years old. He was one of our heroes. He was an Iraq war veteran who returned home as a hero. He left behind a pregnant wife and daughter. That's the reality. Chief Lawrence told us that Brad was like a son to me. At the forum, we also heard from San Francisco Police Chief Greg Suhr. Chief Suhr described a gun trafficking ring that stretched from rural Georgia to California and involved hundreds of firearms. As a matter of fact, the chief told us that a lot of people who are convicted felons there are looking for ways to illegally make money. And so instead of going into drug trafficking, they go into gun trafficking. And he was concerned that we needed some kind of trafficking law, a dedicated law, so that we might address this gaping loophole. Many of these firearms, by the way, ended up in streets of the Bay Area and were recovered at crime scenes across San Francisco and Oakland, including guns in the possession of armed robbery suspects, folks who were on parole. One fell into the hands of a convicted felon, and multiple gang members and drug traffickers. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. This problem is everywhere. It's not just Sandy Hook, it's not just Baltimore, it's not just rural Georgia. Just last week, there were reports of another straw purchasing incident in Colorado, which I'm sure many of you all wrote about. A convicted felon shot and killed Colorado's prison chief and a pizza delivery man. The shooter, Evan Ebel, was on parole after serving 4 years in prison for punching a prison guard in 2008. Now, most Americans already think gun trafficking is a federal crime. I have news for you, it's not. They have no idea that there is no federal law targeting firearm traffickers who commonly use straw purchasers to buy guns for convicted felons and other dangerous criminals who cannot legally buy guns on their own. In Congress, we have heard repeatedly from law enforcement that the laws to prevent straw purchasers are, and this is their words, not mine, toothless, and that they are viewed as nothing more than paperwork violations similar to getting a ticket for going 65 in a 55-mile zone. Again, those are not my words. Those are the ATF and police words. After years of working on this issue and hearing firsthand from law enforcement officials that they needed Congress to strengthen gun trafficking laws, I joined my Republicans and Democrats in February to introduce Gun Trafficking Prevention Act of 2013. This common sense legislation will, for the first time, explicitly prohibit firearm trafficking, and it will make straw purchasing a serious crime by increasing the maximum penalty to 20 years in prison. I'm grateful to have significant support from law enforcement officials from all over the country. Nearly 30 organizations support the bill, including law enforcement officials throughout the nation. These organizations believe our legislation is critical, very critical, to combating the flow of firearms to violent criminals, international cartels, and other dangerous people. The bill also enjoys significant bipartisan support in the House of Representatives, thanks to the thoughtful leadership of Representatives Scott Ridgell, Pat Meehan, and Carolyn Maloney, who joined me in introducing this important legislation. And bipartisan support for the legislation is growing every day. In fact, we now have surpassed 100 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. The legislation also has significant bipartisan support in the Senate. It was passed by the Senate Judiciary Committee with the support of Republican Ranking Member Charles Grassley, and it has the support of Republican senators off the committee as well. And this week, after months of work, the full Senate will vote on this critical legislation. Then it will be time for the House to act. I hope the House Judiciary Committee acts this month to begin the process of marking up legislation so that the full House can vote on a package before summer. I know that we still have a long way to go before the President can sign this legislation into law. But it will be a tough fight, but it will be a fight worth fighting. And we have so much on our side. We have common sense, a desperate need, and most importantly, we have the drive and passion of thousands of families who have been victimized by gun violence. The vast majority of Americans believe that Congress should pass legislation to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. And I know that both the President and the Vice President share this passion for reducing gun violence. For the first time in decades, the White House made preventing gun violence a top priority. Just last week, the President held a press conference on this very issue and reminded our nation that we will never forget those who lost their lives because a gunman decided to pull the trigger. As the President said, and I quote, "What we're proposing is not radical. It's not taking away anybody's gun rights. It's something that, if we are serious, we will do it. Now's the time to turn that heartbreak into something real," end of quote. Now, I've been asked, apart from our gun trafficking bill, whether I support other gun-related legislation, and the answer is I do. For example, I believe fixing the background check system is one of the most common sense actions we can take to prevent criminals from getting guns. And I think that it would complement our gun trafficking legislation very well. Background checks would prevent many criminals from obtaining guns, and the anti-trafficking legislation would impose strong new criminal penalties on those who try to get around the system. For myself, I have chosen to focus primarily on gun trafficking legislation because it is an issue I have been working on for several years in the House. I've worked painstakingly with both Democrats and Republicans to slowly build a bipartisan coalition behind this bill. And I strongly believe that when people understand what this bill does, they will support it wholeheartedly. In fact, even the NRA has come around over the past several months. There are only two groups who should oppose this bill. Let me say that again. There are only two groups that should oppose this bill: criminals and people who want to buy guns for criminals. If Congress can pass firearms trafficking legislation and universal background checks, we will have made real substantive reform that will help to reduce gun violence across our great nation. We are not done yet, but I believe that if we work together and we work hard and we focus on our common purpose of protecting our families from gun violence, then we will succeed. No parent, not one, should have to send a child to school, whether it be Sandy Hook Elementary School or Old Dominion College, and wonder whether he or she will make it home alive. Our country is better than that. We are better than that. Yet, in America's inner cities, suburbs, and small towns, gun murders take more than 11,000 American lives each year, a death toll more than 3 times the number of Americans who lost their lives during the decade-long war in Iraq. That is the reality. We must make these deaths by gun violence transformative. We as a nation must help to heal those families who have suffered so much. Part of the healing process for me and for countless other families is to prevent other senseless deaths from gun violence from occurring again. We in the Congress of the United States must be vigilant and put party politics and rhetoric aside and make protecting American families and future generations our priority. This is our watch. This is our watch. And so, to borrow the words of the great Martin Luther King, he said, we must substitute courage for caution and do what is right by passing meaningful gun legislation as soon as possible. And just one last word. I believe that, when I think about the many young people who have died, I think about our children in Sandy Hook. I think about the mass shootings that we have heard about and seen and witnessed on our television sets and the ones that you have written about. I do believe with all my heart that we survivors do not have the right to be silent. We don't have the right. And with that, I'll take questions.